You're listening to Distraction Therapy with Rob Watson. Conversations about how we find meaning in our lives and what it's like to be part of a metamodern world. Hello, welcome to another Distraction Therapy. Sorry, hang on a second, pause for a second. I just wanted to get some of the coffee shop sounds in, so kind of rather than jumping straight in. But this is another episode of Distraction Therapy with me, Rob Watson, and joined again by Ryan Clayton. How are you?
Very good, thank you. A little down with everything that's been going on in the news, but good.
So in what sense are you down?
I don't know. It's just all been a bit overwhelming seeing it all unfold. It's something I never would have expected to happen, and here it is. You're surrounded by imagery of tanks rolling down streets, people sleeping in subways. I just think it's a lot. I've not really had time to sit down and intellectualize it and process it through thoroughly. It's just that stark invasion imagery.
Yeah, it's pretty epoch changing, isn't it?
Yeah.
And
it feels almost out of time, out of history. You look at it and you hear about it, and it's like, oh yeah, I remember when I was studying history and learning about Hitler in annexing the Sudetenlands in Czechoslovakia. Oh no, wait, these images are from yesterday.
Yeah, these things don't go away. I think the naive. I mean, is it difficult to understand or difficult to get your head around because our naivety or surprise at the audacity of Putin putting this plan into action? You know, it's 50-50, isn't it? You know, kind of it takes a chancer to push through these things, but it also takes a naive idiot to believe that it could never happen and that there are no chances out there who do this kind of thing.
Yeah, well, I think for me it came very much from a place of naivety. You know, I mean, I was born in the mid-90s, grew up in the 2000s, and it's just the kind of thing, you know, you hear about happening historically, and there's always been a kind of low-level political tension between nations to the point where it just kind of fades away and becomes a part of the fabric of everyday life. But to see something so stark and violent and clear, I mean, to go back to the imagery is so evocative of invasion, of war. It's like the kind of thing that you see in film and comics and media all the time as kind of like a visual shorthand for violence and invasion, and to see it happening in real life is just a bit alarming.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Yeah, it's. I mean, we know we've had the Balkans in the 90s. We had Afghanistan and Iraq in the 90s and the noughties. We had 9/11 in the early.
See, even 9/11 for me feels like something very far away. Maybe because I was so young when it happened. It almost feels like it almost feels mythological, fictional.
Yeah, and at the time, one of the things that was stuck out in my mind at the time was people's response to the attack and the fall of the Twin Towers. You'd hear people on news reports saying it was like being in a disaster film. And I suppose the references that you make to something like the invasion of Ukraine is it's like a war film. So we don't have, there's few people who have direct experiential knowledge of what happens in those circumstances and what it's like. But so what you have to do is you have to rely on the mediated, either through news media or through narrative media, through films, through drama, as to being able to put it into some kind of sense.
Yeah, very postmodern, isn't it? the imagery, the fiction preceding the real, and reality taking a backseat because we can't understand it directly.
Yeah, and shock and awe, theatre of war, spectacle, all of that becomes that kind of it's what it looks like rather than what it is in terms of power and politics, because the image is more important, because that's what shapes and guides how we make decisions because of our impressions of that, rather than a cold-blooded assessment of what it actually means in practice. So from a point of view of talking with your friends, colleagues, what's the kind of the reaction among them? Is it?
Well, I did have quite a lengthy conversation about it all with one of my friends at work the other day, and we were just sort of, as we were seeing some of the headlines come in and mulling over some of the stuff that had been happening in the week, I think he came out of it with a very similar feeling to I had. You see it all, and there's just a kind of emotional flatness that pervades. You see it, and it's so overwhelming. And from a position of youthful naivety, it's so overwhelming. You don't know how to comprehend it, and it's shocking, and it leaves you a bit left in the dark. You don't know what to do. You don't really know how to cope with it. It's just, you're aware that it's something that has become a kind of historical fact of human existence, something that has happened and will probably continue to happen. But from the position of not having seen it happen before, not having lived through something quite so stark. I mean, I know I've lived through things like the Iraq War, but they've always felt like very far away things that don't. And I mean, I suppose to a degree this is also quite a far away thing that doesn't really impact you. But I guess it's the first time something like this has happened when I'm sort of old enough to realise the implications and to understand it as it's happening and intellectualise it as an adult. And it's just, we were both left with the impression of, well, how do you even deal with something like that on a personal level? We're all around the office, we're looking at each other thinking, it's just a bit weird, isn't it? Like, here's this massive thing happening, in Ukraine with Russia, and here we are typing out press releases for house builders as if everything's the same. Yeah.
And there's no strong symbol at a time like this that we can rally around. So, Queen and country, or king and country, would have in the past, in the kind of the days of empire, have been the rallying cry in terms of articulating a sense of, nationalism and because this is a failure of collective engagement rather than one single state.
Yeah, well, it was something I wrote an essay on when I was at university, actually, not to get too conservative, but I read some Edmund Burke, I believe it was, and his reflections on the revolution in France. And I remember specifically a part where he mentions monarchy as like you say, a symbol to rally behind, something to bring the people together in times when it's necessary. And yeah, you're right, there is nothing like that. So I suppose, how do you deal with something like this personally?
I think it's a process of sifting and sorting, and reflecting on. I think one of the first things that comes to my mind is to avoid anything that smacks of tokenistic gestures of solidarity. Not that they're not important, and not that people have got to express themselves, but it just seems a lot, futile to send out tweets saying standing with the people of Ukraine, or changing the lights on a building or something like that. And I understand there's a symbolic relevance to that, but also at the same time, it's kind of like, what difference does that actually make? And what changes are you going to bring about to your... So, for example, how are we going to make changes to? We've already had to deal with this with people from Afghanistan, and we've dealt with it really badly. So it's all very well saying you'll stand shoulder to shoulder, but if you don't do anything and you don't change the way that you allow Russian money to run amok in the property market and in financial investment firms, and there's no transparency about that, there's no accountability for that, and similarly there's no kind of provision and support for people to flee from that oppression and tyranny, then it's your solidarity is vacuous.
Yeah, but I suppose...
And it's forcing me to, in a way, I was thinking about this, I've got to come off the fence a bit, and I've got to be a bit more, not just outspoken about it, but actually start to focus on doing stuff that would make that difference.
Get off the pot, Rob.
Yeah, exactly. And it kind of, you're right, it's one of those moments with, and I kind of, the figure I look back to on this, because I kind of, a really brilliant person who faced some of these challenges was, and I've not read a great deal about him, but Václav Havel, who was the Czech president after the fall of the Iron Curtain, and his response was, one of the, I'll misquote him I suppose, but one of the things said, if don't surround yourself with people who tell you that they know the truth, surround yourself with people who are seeking the truth, but if any of them tell you that they've got the idea of what the truth is, so that word should, and ideological purity, and that this is a problem of this particular global order, are usually typically wrong because they're locked in an ideological position. So my first response is usually to kind of reevaluate what the pragmatic response should be rather than the ideological response. But that's from the comfort of a coffee shop.
Well, yeah, exactly. Here we are sipping our coffees, and it's sort of, to come back to something you said earlier about those futile gestures of solidarity. I mean, I totally agree. Something does always rub me the wrong way a little bit when you see people on Twitter saying things like, "Oh, retweet if you stand with the Ukraine." It's like, well, yeah, okay, we get it, but it's also, for me at least, hard to escape the idea that because we exist politically with a representational democracy instead of a direct democracy, almost everything that you do as an individual feels futile. And how do you cope with that very real feeling of futility?
Well, it depends where you think that feeling of futility comes from. And part of the problem is the representational democracy has been hollowed out in terms of our social identities and our, we become atomized. So we're just one calculating machine in a marketplace of ideas, and that we aggregate those and it's in a marketplace, rather than being a member of a class or a particular social economic grouping. So what it kind of does is it throws it back on. There's no group identity. You can't rest in the mass. And Carl Jung warned against that and said that is the route to tyranny, when the only answer you've got is to rely on the mass identification of mass consciousness, rather than the answer, he said, was found in individuals coming to terms with and grappling with these challenges, these existential challenges. But at the same time, we've taken those things away. So we don't have a collectivized process of responding to these things. What we are doing is addressing people on the basis that somehow everybody is rational and is able to come to some kind of view within a marketplace of ideas. So this is why the misinformation and disinformation stuff is really kind of taking grip, because you go onto something like YouTube or Twitter or Facebook, whatever platform you're on, and you're going to be able to view and see a whole range and seek out a whole range of different views, some of which are diametrically opposed, which seem plausible, whether it's about healthcare, whether it's about, I was looking for some videos in the week as an example that's related to this. There's plenty of doctors online talk about how to do weight loss, how to improve your well-being. and they're well-educated people, and they've got they know how to read the scientific literature, but it doesn't mean to say what they're promoting and doing on YouTube is actually sound and that you should follow it, because you can get caught up in some pretty weird stuff, and it takes you on a route where you move away from the common consensus. So you end up in this post-truth environment where there's lots of truths, and that you end up not being able to make that assessment of, well, who do you turn to? Because I've had conversations with people saying, no, the West has misrepresented the Russians, and that we're the aggressors, and that the Russians are only protecting, and innocence and guilt becomes lost, and it becomes harder to find or articulate what is meant by innocence and guilt, or whether there should be a concept of innocence and guilt other than just strategic interest, if you like, which you can then make an assessment on to say, this is how and why this is wrong or right. And I think one of the, I use this expression a lot, you reach a fork in the road, so what do? You take it. And I never know what that is, but at some point you've got to make a choice. And on what basis do you make that choice? And at the moment, I think our politics is now going to be defined by, are you with NATO and our allies, or are you against them? And it'll come down to that simple choice. So people who fraternised with, a kind of love-in with Putin are now going to be seen in a different light. And it's going to be a question of, you've facilitated this monster who's prepared probably to commit genocide.
Yeah, well, it brings everything into a much clearer focus, doesn't it? It shines a light on everything in a way that, although it was never really a secret, was it? It recontextualizes a lot of that stuff in the face of this massive historical event. Well, I think there's something really interesting in that, because I read quite a bit of Marx when I was at university, and for a long time was almost totally convinced of its truth and of its value. And I think the danger lies in the fact that his analysis of the problems and the ills of modern day society and of capitalism are almost bang on, and they match up almost entirely with a normal, everyday person's experience of the way things work. The problem then lies with, because that's so spot on, you're led down this path of just accepting and taking on his solutions to the problem, because it feels like it follows naturally. You're so convinced by this. And, the Communist Manifesto is a great example. It's written in such emotive language that you can't help but get dragged along by it. So you just accept the solutions without really thinking critically about them, because you've already been convinced by his rhetoric of the problems. Whereas in reality, the solutions fall massively short of something that's, workable, especially now.
Well, it's a kind of post hoc rationalisation. He's got it the wrong way round. And he follows that on the basis of my limited knowledge of Hegel, which is that history is somehow an independent force, like gravity, and that universally we follow, as human beings, we follow the path of history. And that's just nonsense. It's not the way.
I don't know. I find Hegel quite convincing, to be honest.
In what way?
I think the way in which he describes the.
I must admit, it's a long, long time since I've read any Hegel.
I find that progression of what he terms human spirit to be very convincing, along the lines of something that kind of develops naturally over time and over history as something that eventually kind of matures out of its own. I can't remember the way he puts it. I think it's in terms of maturing out of its own individuality, which sounds quite scary when you first say it like that, because it does kind of sound like communist thinking. But I'm not entirely convinced that it is. I think that's the stumbling block that Marx and Engels fall over. But it's...
Well, it's because it was what Marx did was he grounded it in a sense of materialism, positivistic materialism. Whereas if you detach, I'm not sure with Hegel how grounded he was. You know, so he's a romantic thinker. He was talking about the human spirit, which is separate from practical experience, praxis and pragmatic experience and material experience. And what Marx, from my vague recollection, does is he kind of grounds that process in the inevitability of experience.
Yeah, which is why I think a slightly more mystical reading of Hegel is necessary, because one of the things that I can never forget, and I was very shocked by it when we were talking it through in, you know, small little classroom, underfunded philosophy department, was the idea that it ends with this process of spiritual maturation, ends in essentially human beings realizing their collective godhood, which sounds like something that's you can see where it's inspired Marx, but also because of that materialistic, that interpretation of Marx that's so rooted in materialism is totally lost. It's almost like you mature and you eventually sort of come to terms with what it means to be.
So there's a collective transcendence of the material position that you're in, which kind of with Marx it wasn't. It was the other way around. It was like, you know, the forget all of that. That's an opiate, and bring it down to your who owns the factory kind of approach. Who owns the land? What was Nietzsche's critique of Hegel?
Basically, that the entire notion of progress was nonsense. That history is always complete. It's not moving towards anything. I mean, we talked last week about the kind of cyclical nature of progress, but I mean, even that gets thrown out the door. There is no such thing as progress. Things just happen. They don't move forward towards and into other things. They just happen, and every moment of history is complete. Not discrete necessarily, but fulfilled.
So what can we learn from that for our present circumstances? Because we're not, this is a process, and understanding the unfolding of history is as a process, not as a series of things.
If history is something that unfolds to begin with.
Right. So, but we've got to find some kind of a thread that we can make it meaningful. And this is that return to kind of we can't just see it as a series of random things. We look for the patterns. I read Arnold Toynbee, the abridged version of the History of Civilization. As I understand it and can recall it, there are certain things that keep archetypal patterns that keep happening in society. So an empire, when it starts to spend more money on outward displays of force and aggression and military and flags and things like that, and its outward identity, and what it does is it doesn't pay attention to its proletariat. And I was speaking to somebody the other day who described how when they went to San Francisco, they were shocked by the amount of people living rough on the streets in the middle of San Francisco. They said it was everywhere. And you've got, when you ignore, so you project your military might, but you hollow out the social experience. And he talks about it in terms of the lack of ability to regenerate yourself. So a society that is, if you like, or a culture that is on the up direction is creative, and people come up with innovative solutions. But one that is on the downward scale sticks very closely to what it only knows and is sure about that. So I suppose you might put that in the context of, say, national identity, armaments, brute force of sticking to the things that you know, and what you're not doing is looking for creative innovation and collaboration and trade and things like that. So what his argument is that there's and he spends, if you read the 7 or 9 volumes or whatever it is, time after time after time after time, societies show how they go through those processes. So empires fall and rise on the basis that they don't pay attention to those things, those contradictions of what would undermine them from within and what would undermine them from without. And it becomes purely a display of force and power, which then gets hollowed out. So the relationship between something like NATO and Russia and China and America is defined in a way by, I think it's woken us up from a dreamlike state to say, yeah, we all got burned by successive failures of Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and it's pervaded us with the idea that we can't do anything about it and that there is nothing that we can do because we would be doomed to fail. And that's what allowed Putin to get into our heads to think that collective action and collective responsibility would not... I mean, the thought that came to my mind is what's happened to the idea of deterrence? What deterred?
Yeah, well,
would have deterred Putin from this?
This is something that came up in the conversation I was having yesterday with one of my friends at work. It was the idea that, and I think that's where the naivety came from initially. It was, you grow up, or at least I've grown up, in a world in which this kind of nuclear weapons have been such a prevalent part of culture and common knowledge. And the idea is that, everybody's got them now, and that they're a deterrent, aren't they? Nobody's going to start World War III because everybody will just become annihilated. But you realise, and I think it might be because they've been around for such a long time now, eventually you realise that, is anybody really going to push that button? I feel like it's entirely possible for
a madman.
Well, yeah.
But usually a man.
But you see, this is the thing. I'm not even sure, even if a war were to break out, that anybody would still push that button. A war would break out, and it would happen like wars usually do, because at the end of the day, nobody wants to kill themselves.
But that is interesting in the sense that it then legitimises the use of the deterrent as the primary driver to avoid global conflict, because the results of that would just be so unspeakably bad for everybody.
Yeah, but at the same time, then it only works as a deterrent against other nuclear weapons. It doesn't work as a deterrent against war. These things just sit there for show, and the same kind of violence and political power grabbing still occurs. And it's war by other means, isn't it? You also you engage in economic warfare, and you engage in. I wonder, as one of the other consequences of this is going to be a further retrenchment of the away from the global economy. So I could posit the idea, and this is the first time I've really thought about it as perhaps maybe a realistic possibility, is that the global supply chains and the reliance on global manufacturing and the way that America and Europe have offshored a lot of manufacturing to the Far East and the supply of resources from Africa and Russia is and we've seen this with like a rehearsal with the pandemic about access to medicines. So access to, I think, paracetamol largely is made in India and imported to the UK rather than it being made in the nearby. And those global supply chains are very fragile. And I wonder if what will happen is people will now start to say, well, actually, we can no longer risk our supply of these essential commodities being controlled by people who are not in our interest. So we need to bring that back into our own domain. Well, I think one of the things that's totally necessary is a complete and thorough demystification of the very notion of a Great Britain. With this tiny island, with these 3 countries that exist all on the same place, that are almost totally incapable of doing anything for ourselves. And I think more needs to be made of that fact.
Well, I think, the stark reality is, and this is the first time I've thought that this might be a distinct outcome, is that we rejoin the EU. Because we're talking about, the collective security of being part of NATO, but our economic security is no longer grounded in a collective body, set of institutions. See, this is where the interesting thing is the crossover is a kind of form of neoconservatism. I don't think the people who run the Conservative Party are conservatives at all. I don't think they look to Burke as a founding set of principles for running our society anymore. And I'm just fascinated, and I've argued this for a while, that kind of maybe somebody like Starmer is coming across as more traditionally conservative than the Conservatives are, because they're the thing that Burke argued against, and people like I've read him and I can't remember his name off the top of my head. Oh, that always happens. The radicals, the people who just want to smash and try something new without knowing what works. And there's a case for that, and there's an argument for that. But at the same time, you break up institutions like the BBC, the NHS, the education system. You devalue the symbols of the state and the monarchy, and that, all of that kind of stuff. Working class institutions, trade unions, and what are you left with? You're left with a society that's very unstable and isn't grounded. And actually, the future politics, we've lived through a period of destabilisation, and let's get rid of everything. Let's sell off our assets to the royal, the wealthy royal families in the Middle East, or sell off our football clubs to various oligarchs around the world. And it's kind of, we've lost focus of what is in our own interest, our longer term interests, and we've just become this kind of cash machine that people from other nations, other places, can come up and just take as much money out of us as we can, and we're left sitting here thinking, well, everything's getting more expensive, I can't afford anymore, my wages aren't going up, and we're faced with this cost of living crisis. And it's interconnected with these other ideas and notions, and maybe have we reached a peak of that? And I'm not calling for change on the basis of, I'm not somebody who says, well, we need a revolution to change the system, like either a systems reboot or a kind of a takeover of the key institutions and mass nationalisation. Yeah. But we need to rethink this.
Well, I mean, you've known me for a while now, and you've heard me talk several times before about the need for not a physical, a political, socio-economic revolution, but instead a revolution of the imagination. It's so totally limited thinking at the moment and all around that, I don't know, there's a total lack of creativity.
What would be the precepts of that imaginative revolution for you?
God, I don't know.
Have a guess.
I think there needs to be a strong focus on individuals developing themselves as individuals. I mean, at the moment, we're in this position...
You sound very Jungian.
Which is astonishing, given that I've never read any Jung. But, yeah, I feel like at the moment, there's a lot of... The reason we're in this situation is we've got a lot of people in power that aren't fully realised individuals. They're not fully realised people. They're so rooted in egotism and narcissism that they can't see beyond this own sort of totally illusory notions of self. It's really quite sickening.
Well, to get where you are in politics these days, you've got to project a persona, to use Jungian terms, and it's the over-projection of that. It's the kind of the psychopomp, he calls it, the pomposity of it, that kind of, it leads to one-sidedness, and it fails to include in a holistic and balanced way all of those other competing elements, and it just pushes you along one. So we've got this absurd situation at the moment where the word freedom is used in America particularly, and it's starting to come into kind of British discourse, probably picked up from people in YouTube and things. So it's come through the anti-vax movement of you're denying us our freedoms. Well, what do you mean by freedom? And the idea that freedom is somehow a virtue of experience which you either have or you don't have.
Yeah. Well, it's like that. Well, it's like the idea that freedom doesn't, the notion of freedom doesn't exist without its antithesis there to demarcate the boundaries. Like in the same way that human beings, you can't experience anything outside of the limitations of your own body. There needs to be something there to demarcate the edges, to even make the notion of freedom intelligible. Because otherwise, I mean, if you'd really take the notion of limitless freedom seriously, you're not really left with much of anything.
Well, this is what I suspect what the present Ukrainian system does. It puts a boundary around that notion. It gives you a boundary. Tanks rolling down the street, people carrying guns, people shelling your house and your school and, wherever else. And people are, death squads on the streets looking for your political leaders. That is a curtailment of the notion of free, and people are going to struggle with that because they've absorbed themselves in a kind of delusional idea this freedom is this kind of open-ended thing, but actually it isn't. It's fixed within our experience. There's no ideological or metaphysical idea of what freedom is. Freedom is merely the result of the interactions, the pragmatic interactions of people. And at some point that means it's got to be compromised. And at some point it means it's limited. But what's it limited by? So that kind of, it's like what happens is you kind of live in a world of infinite possibilities, and capitalism and postmodernism tells us this. Infinite possibilities. Do what you want, be what you want. And all of a sudden you run up against the hard, obdurate reality that only extends as far as somebody allows you to do that.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me of something Camus said in his book The Rebel, one of my favourite books. And it took me a long time to really understand what he meant by it. But he really flips that notion, that Cartesian notion of I think, therefore I am, on its head. And his variation on that familiar saying is, I rebel, therefore I am. You don't exist, and you aren't aware of your own existence and who you are until you have something to push against. And it's when you have something to push against, when you come into collision with other minds and other people, other boundaries, that you're able to see your own boundaries, the boundaries of the self, and you're able to then fully define yourself as a human being.
Ooh, that can lead us down a very deep route. It would probably take us many years to come to, because it raises the issues: what is consciousness, and what are the boundaries of consciousness, and to what extent are we individual agents of conscious agents, or are we part of a collective consciousness?
Well, these are my favourite questions. These are the ones that I revel in. Yeah, they've become totally obsessed with over the last few years.
But if I express some frustration, is that we live in a world where people don't have to face those issues and challenges. The vast majority of people, and I sound terrible when I say it like this, but I can't say it any other way. This is how it'll come out. So apologies to every thinking individual out there, but the vast majority of people are happy not thinking about these things and just going with the mass identity that they've got, because the security there, again, this is a kind of Jungian idea, is that there's the security in mass identity, because you don't have to face up to those existential challenges of being what you do. And there are people out there that we look to that are good at this, or in arts and creative practice and literature and music and politics sometimes, is that people, it's that difference between telling people what they want to hear and telling people what they need to hear. And most people are embedded rightly in the routine of their lives, making their individual daily engagements somehow meaningful in a tough world. So then to ask people to consider the challenges of existential being is a step that most people can't or won't take. And we don't have a system, an educational system, which encourages that kind of discussion, that reflection.
No. It also raises the question to bring Camus back up again, that if essentially the individual is undefinable without something to clash against, does the individual really exist at all? Or are you just a collection of poorly bound together experiences sort of floating through a dream?
Well, I'm trying to work my way through Alfred North Whitehead at the moment. But I think what he talks about is the idea that the Cartesian notion of that the world and our experience of the world is defined by things which have a cause and effect relationship, and the post-Einstein view of the world is that we're defined by processes. So to act in a way that the world is a series of objects and things which can clearly be mapped out and articulated as to what their function is, when you introduce a relativistic process developmental focused view of human nature, and that comes down to that is often described as the difference between Western and Eastern thinking. It's things, and we talked about this last week, about the difference between linear and cyclical thinking, and the idea that if you think of things not as a series of outcomes of a series of interchanges, but as a manifestation of a process, however temporary that process is, then you looking at it from a kind of slightly different perspective. Then you get a different way into it, and you would expect different outcomes from it. I don't know if that makes any sense.
I think I got that. I don't know how to respond, honestly. I'm still digesting it a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, in the present predicament, I suppose it's kind of down to, we think about, as we said, historical processes. What does that mean? And again, one of the things that Jung and many other, you can't just be naively thinking that human nature is all joy and happiness and progress. Is actually it's the other side as well, and that evil, I mean, the manifestation of absolute evil is within each and every one of us. Ask the question the other way, is what holds us back from, I mean, you've asked this a number of times, what holds us back from that complete, anarchy and annihilation of the common good? What stops us being those kind of is it Hume who talks about the Leviathan? That's
is it Hobbes?
Hobbes, yeah. That society is somehow just a mass of competing interests in a massive jungle of kind of the strongest will survive, and that's one side of our understanding of human nature. The other side is this kind of harmonious, peaceful, progressive thinking of human nature. But we are both of those things, and we oscillate between the two, rather than just being, any one of them. So, what would stop despotism and corruption and social antagonism reaching the state that it has in Ukraine happening here?
Well, I suppose there's one way of viewing this Ukrainian crisis as that point of oscillation. We've existed for a while now, at least sort of on a more kind of personal level amongst everyday people of peace. Although, when you take a broader look at things, you realise it's a bit of a myth. And there's been a sort of trouble with self-identifying. People aren't necessarily able to define themselves without latching on to these very tenuous things. And now that we're seeing this crisis in the Ukraine, there's this bigger thing that people are able to push against. And maybe this is the point where people start to be able to find themselves a little better, are able to push back against this thing that's happening near Russia. I don't know.
Well, a thought strikes me is that it's a failure of restraint. So what do we mean by restraint? Restraint externally placed on people or internally defined by people? And it's a failure of both. So to live a harmonious life with other people means moderating and restraining your own impulses, and your mutual respect for one another means that you don't impose yourself on them and they don't impose themselves on you. And therein lies a very naive approach to geopolitics, because people have resources that other people want, and they have land that other people want, and they have it's wrapped up in a kind of a sense of perceived slight and saving face and positioning and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, but that gets played out on each individual human, on a human level, an individual level, but it also gets played out collectively and on a geopolitical level as well. But what we put in place was a social order after the Second World War of externalised restraints, deterrence, a world system of imperfect mutual governance through the United Nations, which is proven to be time and time again to be problematic. And the role of America as the global policeman, as they're described, in terms of America not being able to play that role anymore in a world which is, it used to be unipolar or bipolar, then unipolar after the fall of the Iron Curtain of the Soviet Union. So you're in a situation where people existentially have got nothing to clearly identify with. Something that and so Putin comes along and offers his people strength. And so the symbol that people are identifying with is a strong Russia, and that they will invest in that, and they will follow his lead, because they feel that they're getting something that they can belong to, a flag around which they can feel pride, and a leader around which they can identify. That doesn't seem to be, America doesn't seem to be in that place, or it's a long way from that. It seems, my perception is that it seems a long way from that, and certainly here in the UK, we're a long way from having that sense of identification around something like that.
I do wonder, though, how far that identification behind a strong symbol stretches in terms of the practical example of Russia. Because, I mean, we were talking earlier about I think it was Friday, I woke up and I saw the images of people crowding the major cities of Russia protesting and not wanting this invasion and this war to go ahead, and this kind of growing discontent as the government tries to suppress them. And so there is obviously still, just like there is in America, in England, a kind of division there. And maybe it's just because I'm not familiar with Russian culture. I mean, we're not in Russia. We don't have a first-hand experience of the kind of tensions that exist there. But how widespread is that division? It's very easy from an outside perspective, I think, to look at Russia and to see the symbol of Putin and his invasion of the Ukraine and sort of generalize it to Russia in general. But I wonder how far that stretches that identification in reality.
Well, time will tell.
I suppose it's an empirical question, isn't it?
Yeah.
We can't have an answer sitting here.
But don't be naive that the history tells us that the German people were complicit with Hitler and his ideology and cabal. So you can't absolve it. One of the things that people have been rightly very cautious about at the moment is not of blaming Putin and his cronies and separating them out.
Yeah.
But you can't be a leader without followers, and fascism has taught us that it can be a popular ideology, and so part of the naivety of a liberal democracy is somehow that the people are innocent and they've been corrupted by false leaders. And it's like, that's not always the case. Sometimes it's the case, but it's not always the case. And I think this is a kind of, again, part of the kind of wake-up call to say, how do we deal with this? And what kind of thinking do we need to, as you say, that revolution of imagination, where we look at people in the light of that empirical evidence, not through the lens of some romantic view of what the future might be painted like. There is evil in the world. And people are complicit with facilitating that evil that takes place. And that's kind of what the whole thing forces us to deal with. Where do we stand in that? Where is our dividing line at that point where we go, I would be there on the barricade, or I would be there with a gun in my hand, or a Molotov cocktail in my hand, pushing back against the invading forces.
Yeah. Meanwhile, in England, I've been dealing with it entirely through escapism and not dealing with it. I mean, this is the second serious conversation I've had about it. It's been very therapeutic, to be honest. But before this and after this, I'll go back to reading brightly primary coloured comic books. But
that's it. That's one of the things of don't devalue that. That's essential, because we haven't got those. And this is we haven't mentioned the word metamodernism, and this is one of the things, the return to the reliance on myth, as that's our guiding stories, our guiding symbols that help us to understand. Again, there's a shadow, dark side to that, and there's a positive side to it. So tell us what you're reading and what you see in it.
Well, I allowed myself recently, this was Thursday, when it all became a bit overwhelming. On my lunch break, I took a trip down to the comic shop that's not far from here, and I allowed myself to buy some a collection of Fantastic Four comic books from the 1990s, which, the 90s in general were a bit of a dark period for comic books. It's when they became almost entirely vacuous. They became obsessed with a kind of guns, ultra-violent, kind of hyper-sexualization of the human form. And they're almost, like I say, they're a bit vacuous. So I was reading one on my lunch break. Mr. Fantastic discovers an alternate dimension. The Human Torch is dealing with the fact that he's just broken up with his wife because she turned out to be a shape-shifting alien. Total nonsense, really.
Well, I don't think they are nonsense. I think they tap into something which is very much of the zeitgeist, if you want to use that word, which is, it's the reason Tolkien resonates. If you think about what he experienced and learnt in the First World War, was then applied in his mythology through, and it'll be interesting to see how popular the new Lord of the Rings of Power adaptation is going to be when that's released.
I mean, that sort of stuff has always done very well, hasn't it? Like, I'm thinking of George R.R. Martin as well, and the popularity of his Game of Thrones, because I believe a video game has recently been released based around that sort of source material. I don't know if it's Game of Thrones specifically or something, Game of Thrones adjacent, but apparently that's been incredibly well received as well.
And maybe they're the conversations that we need to start having of, if you like, sitting with people who are immersed in those fantastical cultures, mythical cultures, whether it's games, films, books, whatever, to think about what is that's being articulated, something's being worked through, and does that help people to understand how people think of it as just fantasy, as escapism? You use the word, I think, you escaped into this unreality, and it's like, no, it's not actually an escapism.
Yeah. Well, I do think more highly of popular culture and comic books than that, as you'll know from talking to me. I used the word a little playfully, but there is a sense in which, you escape into these fantasy worlds as a form of therapy. I remember when I was really struggling with depression about 5 years back. One of the things that really helped me get through that time was, again, escaping entirely into the fantasy world of Incredible Hulk comic books. and dealing with my frustrations and my lack of being able to articulate my current predicament through these artificial characters.
And that is entirely the way that we should do it. You know, there is our fantasy life, our dreamlike life that we're all capable of, gets cut off, and we're told that that's not the way to work and exist in our present society. We should be functional. We should be Cartesian in our thinking. We should think about the consequences of what we do. But that doesn't articulate that sense of being. Whereas the myths that we have and the retold myths and the stories that are retold are tapping into something. They wouldn't be successful if they didn't tap into something that was inherent within us. But it will be interesting to see how these myths and the themes of these myths change. And if you've noticed, you know, if you can recall the difference between the periodic changes of comic books from the 90s through to now, and the shift from one articulation of things of interest, I'm trying to find a better word, to to where we are now, it tells us, it's incredibly valuable. It's our storehouse of knowledge. You know, it tells us who we are and what we're grappling with. It points us in a direction towards something.
Well, then this is to bring it back again to Fantastic Four comics. You know, in the 60s there was this massive explosion of creativity in the form of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. Fast forward a little bit, you get the 90s, which, I mean, we've talked about sort of 90s popular culture before in terms of Seinfeld and that kind of postmodern, ironic detachment. And then to bring it back to the current Fantastic Four comics, to mention metamodernism, there is a very sincere approach to how those characters are dealt with now, a return to the kind of sincerity that maybe sort of was lost a little bit, where it's very focused on the family unit of the Fantastic Four and how, you know, they might be dysfunctional, and there's an element of found family there with, you know, their friend, the Thing, being part of the family, and the love that they experience despite having to deal with these, I mean, cosmic hardships. One of the villains is an embodiment of universal entropy, and there's something really fascinating about this family unit coming together, and the thing that saves them from universal cosmic entropy is the love that binds them together, that allows them to forge forward.
Well, I think on that sincere note, that's kind of where we'll leave it for this week, I think, because I kind of, this is my first in-depth conversation about the present circumstance, so all of my thoughts are half-formed and fluid in that sense.
Well, it's helped me work a lot of things out anyway, to think things through, and that's what these conversations are for, aren't they? My personal benefit.
And after the 2 coffees, I've had my legs are twitching now, so I thought I can't really. So, okay, how do people get in contact with you?
I'm on Twitter at Clayton Comics with an X instead of a C and an S.
And I'm Rob W Media on Instagram and Twitter. Just go to robwatsonmedia.net and there's a link there. But as ever, thanks very much, and we'll speak soon. You've been listening to Distraction Therapy with me, Rob Watson. Find out more at robwatsonmedia.net, or follow me on Instagram and Twitter at RobWMedia.